I'm I Will Dominate, and this is Thorin's channel. The guy who, if I keep on associating with him, will get me banned on Twitch eventually.
Do we know when we fly? And when we go, do we die? Yes, question. That's what this is all about. Patreon questions. Of course, brought to you in this particular episode by Gamersups, the delicious sugar-free energy formula. No fillers inside it. Great little peak that lasts for a long time. Lovely taper off at the end. Lots of delicious flavours. We've got plenty of newer ones. I'd try the Clyde's Black Cherry, the classic guacamole Game of Fart 9000, or Dragon Fruit Punch, some of the ones that are always my go-tos. Now, if you want to ask a question in one of my Patreon AMAs, just basically subscribe to the Patreon, link in the description box below, at the $10 or above tier, and you can ask a question either on my Discord or via the site. I put up threads. They're always in the description box below. There'll be a new one there now for the next one. Stephen Dooley says, who is one of the calmest players you have seen in your esports career? Right. The key thing here is, obviously, it's open to interpretation. So it could be in the game. It could be like their demeanor. So I'll use the little combo of both. Like, I think particularly in the game, like, you don't have to know these people or have met these people to kind of get a sense of why I'm going to say it. I think they were very, very calm. Even though what's funny is, a couple of them could be mad spicy outside the game or when the game ended. So I'm going to give you a couple of Quake ones and a couple of Counter-Strike ones. Because I have to say, with StarCraft, especially with like the Koreans, I found them a little bit inscrutable sometimes. Like, even in the game, if they looked like they were calm, sometimes the camera, when they do that amazing OGN or MSL MBC game action shot, you know, where they just like come to the face of the person while he's like playing, some of them did look mad stressed. So I won't pick any StarCraft players. For Quake, I'm going to use two of the classics, and they had an amazing rivalry against each other, probably part of why. It's obviously going to be Cooler and Rafa. With Cooler, because if people don't remember, this was the guy who really broke out internationally by winning ESWC in 2003, when in theory the best player in the world was 0-4. And he beat 0-4 on DM6, which was 0-4's map, by the way. And when he beat him on this map, Cooler was like some 15 or 16-year-old kid. And I think this might have even been the tournament where they hooked up like heart monitors or something. I forget. I know there was some other player in one of those ESWCs who had a heart monitor who was going crazy. But if you ever saw Cooler's demeanor as he just fucking bitch slapped 0-4, the best player in the world, a multiple-time champion, and somebody beating a bunch of the Russian players too, it really looked like it was just like, who the fuck is this noob? Like, it was crazy, his demeanor. And obviously in the game, Cooler, one of the greatest of all time, under pressure, at still using like amazing like lateral thinking, advanced planning, setting up traps, getting out of dodging itself. Like, the way he could actually play was incredible. Now, what's funny is people are going to think, no way, because they're going to think on camera, how many times was he losing? Like, or he won like, yeah, that's after the moment though. In the actual game, phenomenally calm. I always used to think the craziest part about Cooler's game to me, even through Quake Live, was even when he was the inferior player or he was losing to the best player, it's like, how did he always do that thing where at the end of the game, where it's like a one frag game, he can somehow run the clock almost to the very end to execute a trap. He won't panic like the others will, and normal people should. You should just sort of bomb rush them, hope you can make a crazy kill, and then that give yourself a chance to win the game. He would still like set up an ambush, and he'd just get them to fall into it at exactly the right time so it was possible to win. He wouldn't always succeed, but he'd somehow create the scenario where it could happen. And I always thought, how does he do that under pressure? Along similar lines, I think it's absurd what Rafa was able to do in Quake, because he knew he was mechanically not as good as some of the monsters he was playing. But even when they were out dueling him, they were actually turning odds against him that he'd created like favourable scenarios. He could still not only like do max damage himself, but then he could also figure out how to escape and go through some other path in a way where just normal players just couldn't do that. Like, for me, the reason why people like Avec and Strengths just could not beat Rafa when it mattered is because he would make them, the more skilled player, be the one who was flustered and who was overreacting, or who was like scared at one point but then going too aggressive at another point and doing bozo rushes and feeling like, what the hell, I'm missing all my shots. Like, he would just stay consistent. He would just keep plugging away. Yet that's such an amazing mentality for how to play. In Counter-Strike, the first one I'm going to go to immediately, I think it's the easiest one of all time, it's got to be Zipnix. Like, this is a guy where I won't speculate about his mind, but he seems absurdly unaffected by pressure. Doesn't mean he hasn't played bad. He certainly had some terrible points in his career the last couple of years. He's been appalling. But for 5 or 6 years, this guy was like an android. He was like a computer. That's why I hated that they made the Clutch Minister his nickname. I wanted it to be like Counter-Strike Computer or Aalborg Android. Because this guy it was like Data from Star Trek. Well, except before he had the feelings chip or whatever the fuck that shit emotion chip put in. He would just calmly assess the scenario and make the correct play and just mechanically, I mean, not mechanically like skilled, but in like almost a mechanical fashion, just undergo his protocols and win the round or put himself in the best scenario to win that clutch. It was ridiculous how he would do it. He'd do it at all levels. And then the other one I'm going to have to go with is Cold Zero. Like, even though, again, like Cola, outside of the game, he can be mad spicy. Remember that time, like, Simple tried to knife him and he was going mad. Oh, yeah, you whatever. Like, but in the game, though, this guy looked like he never believed he was out of the round. Like, he never thought you were going to win this aim duel against him. Like, he always had this crazy driving, like, single-pointed focus that, like, I'm going to get this kill at this angle. I'm going to get the next kill. That's why I call him the Terminator. I wish I'd done that piece all those years ago. I still will at some point in time, but to me, it's the best nickname ever, the Brazilian Terminator. He just had that thing where he's just going to walk you down. He's going to grind you down. You cannot escape him. He is inevitable. He will just keep coming until he is dead. He had that crazy factor. That's why he was so intimidating, in my opinion. Barbara Stanwyck's legs. What esports, or sports, if you want to go into those, are the worst/best when it comes to royalty? By this, I mean which ones are most prone to having formerly great players get a pass for a long time, and which ones don't see this phenomenon as much. Okay, in terms of like sports, I'll do a sport very quickly for you. The most obvious one to me would be football, soccer. I think in that sport in particular, really great players, they can actually be sort of whacked towards the end. Like, I have to say, I think Messi like, he already had gone a little bit off the boil those last few years in Barcelona, but especially when he went to PSG, like that actual Ballon d'Or was an utter disgrace. The notion he was even vaguely the best was actually disgraceful. And then since then, people just keep propping him up. They just make excuses. Like, by the way, why does he score less goals in an easier league when he used to play in the league that, checks notes, everyone scores the most crazy amount of goals ever? Like, give me a break. Like, it's outrageous. Like, people essentially just love him. I mean, love him. Like, they love this guy more than they love their dad. They love him so much that they just can't even process he has any flaws. Everything has to be someone else's fault, which is crazy because I've always liked Ronaldo, but I'll tell you all day long, I hate the way he dives. I think the last couple of years he made some really silly choices in his career. Oh, there's a bunch of things I could criticize about this guy. So I think football/soccer has got to be one. People are just always in denial that at the end, you're just not as good anymore. CSGO is the main esport. That is a fucking nightmare for this. In games like StarCraft, there's 1v1, so you fall off. People just know you're not as good. In League of Legends even, when the meta even switches or you're on a bad team, people just tell the great players are done, their shit, they're gone. Yeah, there's obviously the rare exceptions, Reckless, Caps, Specky, etc., Bjergsen, but there's not as many. The main one, I mean, you know this if you're asking this question, because I'm the one who came up with the term of royalty in this sense. It's obviously got to be Counter-Strike, hasn't it? Because in Counter-Strike, think of some of these names. Fallen. I would even say, actually, what's mad is, I guess I can't say Rain, because here's the thing. A lot of industry people did treat him like that in like 2020 and 2021, when actually his game was a bit whack. But I guess fans actually were pretty out on him. They were actually saying he should be replaced way earlier, or talking about that. Let me think who else in this game. Oh, Stewie 2K is an obvious one. Skadoodle was one. More European ones. I mean, people were fairly harsh on Guardian, Kenny S. Olaf. A lot of people kept that one going a long time after he was just a bad support player. Just couldn't play like underpass on fucking Mirage, but they were just ignoring that fact because like Nico was carrying him. That was so whack. Yeah, I think Counter-Strike's a really bad game for it. In terms of sports that like I don't see the phenomenon as much, and like I say, League of Legends I don't think happens that much in. I would actually say, in theory, because the problem is they do it a lot with the quarterbacks in the NFL. Like, people were trying to tell me just because the Saints were mega at the end that like Drew Brees was still an MVP candidate. He wasn't. Like, he was busted before they ever got the sick lineups with Alvin Kamara and that. Like, Whereas he was a monster in some of his bad lineups, if you don't know. Obviously, Brady was just propped up till the very fucking end, wasn't he? As if he was still like an MVP at the end. Like, give me a break. But in general, in that sport, they are pretty ruthless, actually, when you foul off, etc. I mean, people even called people like Randy Moss's career over before he went to the Patriots. Let me think. People called Khalil Mack's career over. Oh, loads of players. I'm trying to think what other sports. I feel like actually a good sport for it not to happen in has to be the UFC. I think in the UFC, with the exception maybe if you're for heavyweight, because at heavyweight there's just never enough people. So the big names, like it doesn't matter how many times Overeem gets knocked out. You sort of have to keep him in the mix. Like you just haven't got enough big names to sell the tickets. But aside from that, I think they are ruthless in the UFC. Like you should see how quickly people like Mighty Mouse, fucking Dominic Cruz, who else? Tony Ferguson, Chael Sonnen. Oh, loads of players, loads of fighters have just been called washed way too early or written off immediately when it's like, oh, great, that fight was Shogun. Oh, so many, mate. So Fedor. So, yeah, well, I think that's a pretty good one. Bean Burrito. How would you characterize FlyQuest Impact's career from the beginning up to today? Right, this is actually a question I'll put in one of those polls and I'll do like a long form video just on this topic. It'll just be about Impact. But I'll summarize it. Like the key thing for me is he can never be a GOAT in any context. In LCS for top lane, in the world of League of Legends for top lane. He can't, in all positions, he can never be a GOAT candidate because by definition, his strength was being a supportive / weak side top laner and a tank player and a bruiser player. And it was more that he just had the threat of sometimes if you gave him the strong meta pick carry champion doing the odd game, mainly in LCS, that was the key thing. Now, to me, he's one of the greatest role players of all time. That is how I look at this guy's career. And so I think he's one of the best weak-siders ever from top side. I mean, from any position pretty much. Just a master at knowing how to lose gracefully, how to play from behind, how to play with no jungle attention, how to let other people have all the fucking carry strength, how to peel in a team fight, how to be the one who takes the dick, as they say, so that someone else can succeed. That's why you go look at his teams. I mean, they just rack up finals placings, don't they? No matter what team he's on with, whatever mid and whatever ADC. One of the best imports of all time. An impossibly OP player. Like, remember, as an import, he was a very good import. But when he became like a player who was considered like a naturalized player, like he's just an NA resident, one of the most impossibly OP pieces you can ever have as a result. Because you're just not going to get a player who does that as well, who's an NA resident. That's why so many championship teams have been built around him to allow the other two players to be the imports. I think, quite frankly, he highlights how silly recruitment is and how evaluation works in the LCS. Because what's crazy is all these orgs wanted and got Huni, and even to some degree, summed it. But they all just, everyone gets rid of Impact way before his time's up. Like Cloud9 did, and we think NRG, Immortals, Team Liquid, Evil Geniuses. Like, I don't get it, mate. It's the other way around. Like, if anything, you want to get rid of Huni and get this guy, they just don't get it. Now, as far as I know, it's a bit like the Smithy thing where he should have been in more good teams. Like, people think it's like, it's just work ethic, or he doesn't put in the hours early on, or, he has like a contentious personality. No. He's on some Dennis Rodman shit. He's so good at what he does and uniquely good. And the reason why with Dennis Rodman, by the way, you let him have all that space and be a bit of a dick is because then he gives the ball back to Michael Jordan all the time from offensive rebounds. So Michael Jordan just gets to have his misses not count against him, essentially. They obviously do statistically. And he gets another crack at it and he's the greatest player of all time. So similarly, if you have Doublelift or Bjergsen or Jensen or fucking Sven or something, you probably want this guy as your top player. This is the guy who is going to allow you to carry. That's why it's so smart that Papa Smithy got him onto FlyQuest. Look, the Vicar angle didn't work out, but the Prince one, it works out like a motherfucker. Have this guy peel for him. Have this guy attract jungle attention so that the bot lane's just farming 2v2 or 3v2 if they have the gank. So to me, I think a bit like Smithy, he was mad underrated by the LCS region. It's so silly. It shows how bad their evaluation is. Like I say, let's do a long form video on that one. I think that could actually be really good. Mouse says, any audiobook you enjoy and can recommend, right? I don't listen to audiobooks. Like, I have almost never listened to audiobooks, beyond maybe when I was a child in the car or something, which wasn't my choice necessarily. So I can only, from memory, even remember one I ever listened to. It was decades ago now. It was back in the 90s when the X-Files was the big thing. And that guy, Mitch whatever, who wrote some of the episodes and played like, I can't remember if his name was Skinner in the thing, but it's like the guy who was sort of like Principal Skinner. But he was like, you remember the guy who was like the balding guy who was like, Mulder, what are you doing? And he'd sometimes be on the FBI side early, but then he was mainly eventually a legit guy within the FBI who was helping him. That guy actually voiced it. It was called like X-Files Ruins or something. I won't tell you the plot, but it's one of those ones with like a supernatural component. It was all right. I just don't enjoy audiobooks personally. Like I find it hard enough on podcasts. Like one of the reasons I like to do a walk sometimes to listen to a podcast is because it's the other way around. I zone out of the walk and just sort of go around and get the exercise, and then I'm listening and I'm immersed in the podcast. If you listen to an audiobook, I'll get the feeling a lot of people. It's that addictive thing of like, I've got my phone, I've got to think, I've got to be checking something. You're not going to be properly listening then. It's just going to wash over you. So I just find it's not that great in that sense. So it's just not for me. I prefer to be forced to actually focus on the page, have no distractions, and get into the book. Joseph Adcock, I 100% agree with your take. By the way, I know this is just the way people phrase it, but like, just say like, I agree. Like the whole thing, like I 100%, usually most people don't even 100% when they say that. And then also like, I'm not a person where you need to agree with me for me to be able to listen to what you're saying and have a good convo. I 100% agree with your take that for a map to be competitive and deserve a spot in the pool, there should be classic games played on the map. This obviously isn't the only thing you say, just a part of it, I believe. What would you consider to be classic games on the more original maps? Train 2017 League, E-League, he means their major final, immediately jumps to mind for Train to me. Does Vertigo and Ancient have a classic game, in your opinion? Right, here's what's really confused me about this question. You know, as part of what I'm doing here is actually to sort of level you up on how you ask questions, so that then I can understand what you mean and answer it better. Like, you can ask this question again if you want, because I actually think this is probably a good one also for the poll, for the people who have like $25 or more and want to vote in that, and I'll do the videos. You'll see a couple of them coming out soon. Now, what puzzles me and I think throws me off, and I think I'm not going to give you the answer you want here, is when you said Train, I don't know what you mean, because when you said the more original maps, I'm thinking, right, he means the original maps, like Dust 2, Inferno, Train, Nuke, and then you go Train, so I'm thinking, right, that's what he means the original maps. But then you say, does Vertigo and Ancient have a classic game in your opinion? Is that a separate question? Because if that's contextually tied to the idea of original maps, maybe by original maps you mean like the ones that came out in CSGO that weren't ones from the history of Counter-Strike, like Vertigo, which is sort of oil rig, but whatever. Ancient, sort of Aztec, but you know what I mean? In this case, Anubis. Maybe you mean that. Like, you actually want me to say if those maps have a classic game. So the problem is, that's the context I'm inferring here. So, unfortunately, I'm not going to answer for, like, Inferno, Dust 2, etc., but I can give you some of the best ever. So, again, maybe ask the question again, or just send me a DM and tell me what you meant, because I think this actually would be a good video. Maybe just the greatest games on specific maps, or some classic or iconic ones. Maybe iconic's better, because it's hard to do the greatest. You have to go through all the games, wouldn't you? So, like I say, the Train one just throws me off, mate. So if we're talking about maps like Ancient, Vertigo, I don't think Anubis has ever had one yet. That's one of the problems. And that Na'vi versus FaZe one was just an exciting game. It was not a great game of Counter-Strike, even on that map or in general. Ancient, I think, just had it yesterday. They had one with FaZe and ENCE in the semi-finals of IEM Dallas, and it's a banger. If you haven't seen it, go watch it from the beginning. Watch how P-Plex Empires start. Watch some of the calls from FaZe. Look late in the game how FaZe get... Basically, it was a really, really good game. An absolute classic, instant classic, map of the year so far. Vertigo, I think generally, I'd have to revisit it, but I don't think it has them. There's been so many Vertigo team games played. I mean, think of some of the classic teams of Vertigo. You had Vitality lineups. You had, G2 was even pretty good with the Kenny S. Hunter lineup. You had, let me think. An obvious one would be Furia. You had, at times, heroic lineups, more the refresh one for me. You definitely had classic Gambit / Cloud9 was very good on it. These teams all play this map and could be really good on it. But how many classic games can you think of? And I mean classically, it has to be high-level play, not just exciting, etc. So I don't think it had them. Like, people are going to point to that, like, Dupree performance on T-side against Cloud9 to get him out of dodge at IM Rio. That's just because it's Dupree and he got a load of kills. It was crazy. Like, it wasn't really a great game, was it? Like, that was a massive failure by Cloud9. I mean, the obvious one people are going to point out is the quarterfinal game at Starladder Berlin Major between Team Liquid and Astralis and the genius pick from... It wasn't a good game, though. Like, it was like, actually, Team Liquid was doing fine the first half. Then they just got blown away in the second half and didn't get any fucking T rounds. It was actually quite a shit game all in all, even though there were some good moves from Astralis. These aren't truly great games. Like, the closest from memory I can think of actually goes the other direction on that map, which is a few months after Berlin, there was the ECS Season 8 final, where Team Liquid played Astralis. The opener was Vertigo, and actually Team Liquid won this time. It was an epic game. I think this was the one where NAF went crazy. It was totally back and forth. It was really nervy. It was some of the best, actually, Counter-Strike Team Liquid played, even though this was after their attempted era. And it actually was one of those games that made you think, maybe they can actually do this, mate. Maybe finally they're going to beat them in the big series when they're back to their sort of near peak level. Because remember, that was when Astralis was maybe going to have a second mini era or something. By the way, like I say, I think this is probably a good one for the poll. Because the problem as well with the whole original thing is, if you don't know, I actually think Counter-Strike lost its way to some degree. One of the reasons why 1.6 was amazing until the last sort of year and a half, when idiots like DreamHack and ESL added in shit maps like Forge or whatever, was you had these maps that were just really fucking good, and there was just 5 of them. And so it made the veto a bit more obvious, but you played all these maps and you had your perma. So there was just 2. There was Inferno, there was Nuke, there was Train, and there was Tuscan. Now, the way those went was, I've always made this point, that's why it was a great pool. Dust 2 and Tuscan are individual star maps, Fragger maps, T maps. Nuke and Train are super CT-sided, super team player focused, you need a lot of tactics on T-side, and Inferno is somewhere in between, isn't it? And isn't the best AWP map, you can still use the AWP sometimes. That's what made these maps so good. And as a result, teams from Nordic countries would be amazing on Nuke and Train. And then maybe if we're talking more traditionally, teams like German teams would be good on Dust 2 and Inferno. And then famously, the Russian/CIS teams used to always overperform on Tuscan and could really get things going there because they liked aggressive play with the AK. If you don't know, this even goes back to the classic Quake World map pool for TDM, TB3, the big 3, which was E1M2, DM3, and DM2. These are just the best maps. They always produce classic play. They'll never get boring, the same way as a chessboard doesn't get boring in an NFL field and a basket NBA court doesn't get boring. It's the sport and the variables otherwise that you interchange. So yeah, I think this is a good question. I just want a little bit more sort of clarification if you want me to go more in depth. Bar Ado Mushroom says, is Nardwar the best music interview? I assume he means interviewer, right? I don't know if this is some troll, and because he said interview, he's trying to say it in a silly way, and it's supposed to be a meme, because I've never got this. I can't tell if people say they like Nardwar as a sort of Discordian joke, they mean it sarcastically or ironically, obviously no one actually likes him. People who actually say he's a good interviewer, I've got to say this, you're exactly the sort of person I will never create content for. And I don't think actually you would vibe with my shit at all. Because here's the thing, I despise pointless trolling and wasting people's time. I don't think it's very funny. I don't think that Borat is funny. I think it's actually fucking gross. I don't think in between two ferns is funny. I think it's just garbage. It's actually just fucking bad. There's nothing, I don't get anything out of it. So I have to say, I've barely ever seen this guy's interviews, but I've seen a few over the last 20 years, and I thought they were fucking terrible. They were really obnoxious. They weren't good interviews. They didn't get interesting answers. Maybe you like them because they sort of signal jam compared to just a bozo. How are you feeling? So what about the new album? Okay, maybe not. I will say, I think music is one of the areas of some of the worst interviews ever. On my side channel, I did a banger interview with TB, the legendary Norwegian drum and bass producer and DJ. I don't think you'll ever get an interview on that level normally. It's why actually, in a weird way, I actually think some of the Zane Lowe interviews, obviously the classic ones with the Kanye ones, can be really good. Mainly because I get the sense, and this is a skill of an interviewer, he actually knows some of these people and has ingratiated themselves in their lives and become friends with them. So he sort of knows what to push them towards that they might want to talk about, but only if he sets it up in this way and sort of allows some space and then carefully guides them through so they don't say what they don't want to say. And also, let's be real, he's just a talker. He doesn't seem like a super deep thinker, but a lot of artists love to sniff their own farts. So if you set them up right, they will talk at length and give all those great thoughts, like a lot of those good Kanye interviews. So I think Zane Lowe's had some pretty good ones. Generally, I do think interviews are shit, though, especially from fanboys of music, of comics and fucking movies. So I actually think it's one of the reasons I did the Thorin quiz series. I was like, you know what, I've got my own skill set here. Why don't I just interview them? I already know all this shit. I've done my research. I've had some deep thoughts about it. I've thought of some angles. I'll just go and do the interview myself. I think they're bangers. Obviously, it's a shame I didn't do it 6 years ago when every video used to get 50k views or whatever, but whatever, it is what it is. I'll take a few K views. It's about doing quality work, not necessarily about raw success and tapping into the algorithm, is it? Theogony. When assessing rookies that show promise, what skill/mindset do you think has shown to be an indicator of greatness most often, sport or esport? I mean, one of the first ones that's very rare, but it matches people like Rops, and look how great he became. I would say Monacy has this, is people who actually seem, even at the beginning when they're young and just really skilled and talented, like really reflective, really like they understand like their game isn't totally there yet. They're not at the level of the legends and the greatest players in the world. They have the right mindset for improvement. And also they know to be humble and to show respect to legends and stuff. I think that's a really good indicator. Like there's not many players that had that. Valde had that. There's not that many that have had that then didn't work out basically. Then in terms of other qualities, I think obvious ones are like smarts. Like if you show intelligence in the game, like there's something Rob showed very early on. I think that suggests actually that you can be a very, very good player. Like at the end of the day, hands can go or hands can just only get you kills and stuff, but playing with your brain will nearly always be the best way to play. Spatial awareness, positioning, how you set yourself up for your kills, what your understanding is, depending on like different variables being thrown at you that you couldn't be prepared for. I would say a classic one that people like Stefano and maybe even early Monacy have had is obviously simple, is like insane courage on stage. Just somehow in pressure matches, you just perform, you just frag out, you just play great. I would say the obvious one that everyone sees though is absurd mechanical talent, but there's ways that it's not as obvious though. Like I think people like Rez, Lecro, let me think. I mean, even some people like Acor and Mertz and some of these players, definitely some of the NA players. Some of these players just have nice mechanics, like they have like nice peak aim. Whereas the difference is, like here's the difference. I actually think in terms of like hitting a hard shot, Twists can do a way better crazy precision shot than Rain. But Rain's aim is way more consistently like 8 out of 10. And that's why when they're entering, the difference between the two is crazy. Twist is super streaky, can do impossible things, but can also just blow it completely. Whereas Rain, you just know it's so he's essentially like 90% of Nico. It's just always to the head, it's always clean, he's always positioned well, it's always consistent, he knows which kills he can and can't get. Like, that is a little bit more nuanced, I think, than people realize, because people just look for the really insane skilled one. Like, the best analogy right now for me, because I love that angle, that lens that Cassard gave me of sharp. There's a difference between having just sharp aim and being a good player, or like a well-rounded player, or actually a really skilled player. The obvious example to me is Boros from Monty is really sharp. Like his raw, like mechanical aim, just instant, like going for the head is really, really good. But the rest of his game's not very good, actually. He's very incomplete. He's got a lot of flaws in his game. It doesn't seem like that smarter player right now. Whereas actually the Immer guy, who was almost the MVP of the major at Blast Paris, he doesn't even have the most bonkers headshot aim, but his AK is so consistent. He's so well positioned. His pacing is excellent. He has his techniques down, and they just hit round after round after round after round. Like that might not jump off the page in the same way, but that guy looks insanely good. It's why early on in Furia, before he got as good as he is now, I always thought Yuri was the better player out of him and Keserato. Keserato had the crazy sharp aim, but his game was all over the place. Yuri actually looked like the more well-rounded player early and was the one that you could actually rely upon. So, yeah, there we go. I think that's a pretty good one. I actually think, yeah, I don't know for sport as much. Because for sport, I do think a lot of that it depends what the sport is, but a lot of that is stuff like working on very boring stuff. Like in the NFL, if you're a wide receiver, running the route tree, learning to fake out the defense, studying film. If you're talking about someone like a quarterback, it's like, do they hold the ball too long? Do they know how to do the simple check down instead of going for the hero play every time? There's a lot of like overrated quarterbacks now that do some of that stuff where it's like they're still playing like it's college, mate. They don't actually understand the system. So I think for sport, it's a lot harder. In the NBA, I would always say people who have like good footwork or understand the basics of defense or the flow of an offense, not just how to get their own shot. There's an obvious one that you could go with. In the UFC, for me, it's always been understanding of like identifying your opponent's weaknesses. If a fighter can do that, he can be a truly great fighter. If a fighter just succeeds off his strength, that's when it gets a little bit tricky. Like I think to some degree, that's one of the things that fucked Conor McGregor. He wasn't a super well-rounded guy who just went to where you're weak and beat you like a John Jones, GSP. He had his strengths, and when they worked, he could beat you. I also think that's why you didn't see a lot of title defenses, because if he'd have fought certain people, I think he would have lost earlier, and he would have lost a lot more since, even though he's lost a fuck ton anyway. Yeah, so there'll be a thread in the description box below with the next questions thread. Like I say, a couple of these, I'm going to do a poll, do it in a day or two, where people who are at the right take can vote on it, and then I'll do a video, a full-form video just on that topic. Yeah, check out the Patreon. Where I come from in England, people will often say, oh yeah, you and whose army? Well, I'll tell you what, I've got my own army backing me up. They're called the Skrilluminati. Thank you to Ahmed Hadjou, Joseph Adcock, Matt Pugnatio Rajcula, Theogony, Animosity, Bot Pounder 420, Jensen Goh, Tobias Bernasconi, Tosh, Toucan, and as always, you know it, a special thanks goes out to my boy Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? You want teasers, find out who's in the upcoming interviews? Do you want to ask me a question in my monthly AMA? Maybe you want to be part of those long discussions where we talk about anything and everything in esports. Well, if so, put your money where your mouth is and enlist today in the Skrilluminati via the Patreon link in the box below.